The year was 1886, and the land in this corner of the Wyoming Territory did not suffer fools gladly. It was a place of stark realities, where the wind scoured the plains with a gritty persistence that wore down stone and spirit alike. For Elara Vance, newly widowed and left with little more than a 7-year-old son and a deed to a patch of ground nobody wanted, these realities were the first thing she felt in the morning and the last thing she heard at night. The property, her estranged father's final bequest, was a cruel joke on its face. A tilted, slat-sided shack clinging to a low rise, surrounded by 15 acres of gravelly soil and stubborn sagebrush. The dollar valuation on the legal papers felt like an overstatement, an insult added to the injury of her grief. Most folks in the nearest settlement, a collection of sod houses and false-fronted stores called Providence, saw her inheritance as a burden, the final, pathetic legacy of a man they had always considered peculiar. Silas Croft had spent more time staring at rocks than tending a crop, and his daughter, it seemed, was now paying the price for his eccentricity. But Elara was not planting. In the weeks following her arrival, as the late summer sun beat down with a dry, unforgiving heat, she did something that shifted the community's opinion of her from pity to profound confusion. She began to dig. Not a garden patch, nor a well, but a massive, rectangular pit adjacent to the dilapidated shack. Armed with her father's worn spade and a heavy-headed pick, she labored from sunrise until the light failed, her slim frame casting a long, lonely shadow across the deepening excavation. Her son, Thomas, hauled away the looser soil in a small wooden cart, his face smudged with dirt and determination. The work was brutal. The topsoil was thin, giving way quickly to a dense, clay-like substrate packed with stones. Each swing of the pick sent a jarring shock up her arms, and every shovelful of earth felt heavier than the last. She was not merely digging a hole. She was quarrying the very land itself. Her movements methodical and relentless, driven by a purpose no one else could fathom. It was not long before the observers came. First came Dora Kelleher, whose husband, Amos, ran the most prosperous homestead a mile to the east. She arrived under the pretense of offering a jar of preserves, her eyes wide with a practiced sympathy that barely concealed a ravenous curiosity. She saw the mounting piles of earth, the deepening pit, and the sweat staining the back of Elara's simple dress. "My dear Elara," she had said, her voice dripping with concern, "whatever are you doing? This is no time for such exertion. You should be resting, grieving." Elara had paused, leaning on her shovel, and offered a polite but brief explanation. "I'm building, Mistress Kelleher." Dora's gaze flickered from Elara's resolute face to the hole in the ground. Building what? She had clearly wanted to ask. A grave? But she held her tongue, offered the preserves, and retreated back to Providence, her mind already composing the story she would tell. The poor widow Vance. Her grief had finally cracked her, digging her own cellar to madness. Amos Kelleher followed a few days later, his approach more direct and devoid of social niceties. He was a practical man, a man who understood the unforgiving calculus of frontier life. Work equaled survival, and wasted work equaled death. He stood at the edge of the pit, which was now nearly 6 feet deep and 20 feet long, his thick arms crossed over his chest. He chewed on a piece of straw, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice a low rumble, I don't mean to pry, but I can't make sense of this. If you're digging a root cellar, you're going about it all wrong. It's too wide, and it'll freeze solid come January unless you sink it another 10 feet. And if you're looking for water, you're wasting your time on this rise. The creek bed is your only hope for a well. He was not being unkind. He was stating facts as he understood them, offering the established wisdom of the land. He saw a woman alone, making a terrible, energy-sapping mistake when her focus should have been on stockpiling wood and reinforcing the flimsy walls of the shack against the coming winter. Elara wiped her brow with the back of a dusty glove, her gaze steady. She had anticipated this visit, this voice of logical but incorrect objection. "It's not a cellar, Mr. Kelleher, and I'm not looking for water." Amos squinted. "Then what in God's name is it?" She considered for a moment how to explain a principle to a man who only trusted in outcomes he had already witnessed. Watching a thing happen was not the same as understanding why it happened. And the men of Providence were watchers, not thinkers. They knew a good fire kept you warm and a thick wall blunted the wind. But they did not question the nature of heat or the movement of air. "I'm building a home," she said simply. Amos let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A home? In a hole in the ground? Mrs. Vance, people live in sod houses because they lack timber. They don't burrow into the earth like prairie dogs. The cold comes down from the sky, not up from the ground." He shook his head, a final, dismissive gesture. "You'll freeze in there, you and the boy. Mark my words." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil, leaving Elara alone with the silent pit and the weight of his certainty. Amusement, she had realized long ago, was a much safer position for most people than confusion. The community chorus, led by Dora Kelleher, echoed Amos's sentiment, though with a softer, more pitying tone. The story of the mad widow digging her own winter grave became a common bit of gossip over sewing circles and at the general store. Some offered prayers, others offered unsolicited advice about salting pork and mending coats. All of it was predicated on the same unshakable assumption that Elara Vance was a fool, a woman broken by tragedy, engaged in a nonsensical act of self-destruction. Only one person, a quiet woman named Constance Hartwell, whose husband had been lost to the same winter fever that took Elara's, watched without comment. She would sometimes pause her wagon on the track 100 yards away, observing for a few moments before moving on, her expression unreadable. In her silence, Elara felt not judgment, but a cautious curiosity, a willingness to see what would come of it all. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, in a world that had already passed its verdict. Elara did not resent their skepticism. She understood it. Their knowledge was hard-won, a collection of traditions and techniques that had proven just barely sufficient for survival. They built their homes above the ground, where they could see their enemy, the wind, the snow, the cold. They fought that enemy with fire, consuming vast quantities of precious timber in a constant, roaring battle against the encroaching frost. Her project defied this logic. It proposed a different relationship with the land, not one of constant opposition, but of quiet cooperation. The source of this radical idea was not her own, but her father's. In a dusty crate tucked into a corner of the shack, she had found his journals. For weeks, she had been too deep in her own sorrow to look at them. But one night, with the wind rattling the shack's loose boards, she had opened the first leather-bound volume. What she found inside was not the ramblings of an eccentric, but the meticulous, lifelong study of a brilliant, self-taught naturalist. Her father, Silas, had not been a failed farmer. He had been a geologist, a man who read the story of the earth in the strata of rock and the composition of the soil. Page after page was filled with elegant script, detailed drawings of rock formations, and careful notes on temperature variations at different depths throughout the seasons. He wrote of the land not as a surface upon which to grow things, but as a vast reservoir of thermal energy. He called it the thermal flywheel, a concept he had pieced together from observation and scientific texts ordered from back east. The Earth, he argued, absorbed the immense heat of the summer sun, storing that warmth deep within its mass. While the surface temperature fluctuated wildly, from over 100 degrees in August to 40 below in a January blizzard, the temperature 10 feet down remained remarkably stable, hovering in the low 50s year-round. The key, his journals explained, was not just depth, but material. And that was the secret of this seemingly worthless plot of land. The shack was not placed randomly. It stood directly atop a massive, deep vein of soapstone. He had mapped it, tested it, and understood its unique properties. Soapstone, he wrote, possessed an unusually high thermal conductivity and an immense capacity for heat storage. It was a natural battery. A conventional root cellar, dug into ordinary soil and clay, would indeed freeze, as Amos Kelleher had warned. The surrounding earth simply couldn't hold and transfer warmth effectively enough to combat the overwhelming cold seeping down from the surface. But a chamber carved into soapstone, insulated above by a thick layer of sod, would behave differently. It would slowly bleed the deep earth warmth into the living space, creating an environment that would not freeze, that would remain temperate and livable, with only a minimal source of supplemental heat. This wasn't a house that would fight the winter. It was a house the winter would barely notice was there. She had tried to explain a sliver of this to Amos, speaking of how the earth held the summer's warmth, but the words had been inadequate. How could she convey decades of obsessive study to a man who only knew the heft of an axe and the glow of a wood stove? His world was one of tangible efforts and immediate results. He chopped wood, the wood burned, the fire gave heat. It was a simple, linear equation. Her father's principle was an invisible force, an abstract concept that required a leap of faith. The men of Providence trusted what they could see and touch. They could see the snow piling up, feel the wind biting their skin, and see the fire consuming the wood. They could not see the latent heat stored deep in the rock beneath their feet. To them, her explanation sounded like magical thinking, a folk tale whispered by a grieving mind. They saw a hole in the ground and heard a nonsensical reason for its existence. They could not see the elegant, powerful principle that guided her every swing of the pick. By late September, the pit was complete. It was a clean, sharp-edged rectangle, 25 feet long, 16 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. The final few feet of digging had been the hardest, requiring the pick and a crowbar to break through the solid, greenish-gray soapstone that formed the floor and lower walls of her new home. The work had reshaped her. Her hands were calloused and strong, her arms corded with muscle. The haze of grief had been burned away by the fire of physical labor, replaced by a singular, sharp-edged focus. Now began the second phase of the work, the construction. Using timber she and Thomas had salvaged from a collapsed barn 3 miles away, hauling each piece on a crude travois, she began to frame a low, gabled roof over the excavation. The central ridge beam was a massive piece of cottonwood, and setting it in place was the greatest challenge she had yet faced. It took her 3 days of careful work with levers, ropes, and a system of counterweights made from buckets of rock to hoist the heavy beam and settle it into the notches she had carved atop two sturdy posts. The rafters went up next, angled to create a gentle slope. She did not have the luxury of milled planks for the roof deck. Instead, she laid a dense lattice of smaller poles, then covered this with a layer of tough prairie grass, and finally, the sod. She cut the sod bricks herself from a patch of meadow near the creek, each one a heavy, dense block of earth and roots. She and Thomas hauled them up to the roof and laid them carefully, grass side up, packing them tightly together. This thick, living blanket of earth would be her primary shield, an insulating layer that would catch the snow and use its own insulating properties to further protect the dwelling. It would shed the rain, blunt the wind, and in the summer the grass would grow, making the home seem like a natural extension of the hill itself. The walls of the excavation were mostly the smooth-faced soapstone, but the upper portions, where the earth was looser, she lined with stones gathered from the creek bed. She mortared them in place with a mixture of clay, water, and straw, a technique her father had described in his journals, packing it into the gaps to create a solid, airtight barrier. A small, efficient cast-iron stove, one of her few valuable possessions, was carefully installed against one of the stone walls. Its stovepipe vented up through the sod roof via a double-walled flue packed with sand to prevent the risk of fire. She built a heavy, insulated door at one end, which opened into a short, descending tunnel that connected to the floor of the old shack. The shack itself was now transformed. It was no longer the primary dwelling, but an Arctic entry, a crucial airlock that would buffer the stable environment of the dugout from the volatile world outside. She sealed its many cracks with the same clay mortar, turning it into a functional windbreak and storage area for wood and supplies. As she worked, she felt a growing sense of connection to her father, a man she had known mostly through a child's memory of his quiet strangeness. Now, she understood him. Every detail in his journals, the optimal thickness of a sod roof, the right mixture for mortar, the importance of a cold sink near the entrance, was a piece of a carefully considered system. He had not left her a worthless piece of land. He had left her a blueprint for survival, a key to unlocking the land's hidden strength. The first snows came in early November, a light dusting that melted by midday. But the cold began to settle in, a persistent chill that clung to the nights and hardened the ground. The people of Providence watched Elara move the last of her belongings from the shack down into the earth. They saw the wisp of smoke rising from the flue pipe that poked up from the grassy mound. They shook their heads and stoked their own fires higher. The stage was set. The community had placed its bet on tradition, on roaring fires and thick coats. Elara had placed hers on a dead man's theory and a deep layer of soapstone. Now, all that was left was for winter to arrive and declare a winner. It came on the third week of November. A change in the sky, a darkening to the northwest, a particular quality to the wind that spoke not of a passing squall, but of a siege. The air grew heavy and still, a deep, ominous silence that was more threatening than any gale. Elara recognized the signs from her father's writings. This was a blizzard, a true plains blizzard. She secured the door of the shack, checked the flue on the roof, and brought the last of the kindling down into the dugout. With Thomas beside her, she closed the heavy insulated door that separated their subterranean home from the entry tunnel, plunging them into a quiet, fire-lit world. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, small and hard, driven by a rising wind. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked over the prairie, a relentless, high-pitched howl that Elara could hear only as a distant, muffled moan, a sound seemingly miles away. The temperature plummeted. Within hours, it was 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. For the homesteads of Providence, the world became a maelstrom of noise and cold. The wind tore at their walls, seeking every crack, every weakness. Snow piled in monstrous drifts, burying windows and doors. Inside those homes, families huddled around their stoves, feeding them a constant diet of wood. The iron glowed cherry red, radiating a circle of desperate heat that barely reached the corners of the room, where frost formed thick and white on the interior walls. The battle was constant, exhausting, and terrifying. Down in the earth, Elara's world was one of profound tranquility. The small stove needed only a single log every few hours. She did not need a roaring fire because she was not fighting the full fury of the winter. She was only tempering the cool, stable air of the earth around her. The soapstone walls, which had been slowly absorbing the warmth from the stove for weeks, now radiated a gentle, even heat back into the room. There were no drafts, no rattling windows, no howling wind. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the quiet turning of pages as she read to Thomas, and the steady rhythm of their own breathing. This was the test of faith. For 3 days the blizzard raged. They were utterly cut off from the world, suspended in their quiet pocket of stability. She had to trust the process, trust that the tons of earth and stone above and around them were doing their invisible work. She would occasionally place her hand on the stone wall. It felt cool, not warm. But what she felt was the profound and absolute absence of cold. It was a deep, unyielding neutrality, the feeling of the earth's own constant heart. On the morning of the 4th day, a new sound, or lack thereof, woke her. The distant moan of the wind had ceased. Silence. A deep, crystalline silence had fallen over the land. The storm had broken. She banked the fire and prepared to face the aftermath. Putting on her heaviest coat and boots, she kissed Thomas on the forehead. "Stay here. I'll be back in a moment." She walked to the insulated door, lifted the heavy wooden bar, and pulled it open. The air that flowed in from the entry tunnel was not just cold. It was a different substance entirely. It was a pain-inducing, lung-searing cold, so intense it felt like a physical blow. She moved quickly up the tunnel and pushed open the door to the old shack. The world outside was a revelation, a landscape transformed. Everything was buried under a blanket of white, sculpted by the wind into fantastic drifts and dunes of snow. The sun was brilliant on the fresh powder, the sky a piercing, painful blue. The air was perfectly still, but the cold was a palpable entity, a presence that stole the breath and stung the eyes. It was, she guessed, at least 40 degrees below zero. The sheer violence of the temperature was shocking, and in that shock came the full, triumphant realization of her success. The difference between the world inside her dugout and the world outside was not a matter of degrees. It was a matter of survival and death. The air in her home was safe, breathable, and calm. The air out here was a weapon. She stood for a long moment, taking it all in. Then, a small, quiet smile touched her lips. She could feel the sensory proof tingling on her skin, the sharp sting of the cold a testament to the warmth she had left behind. This was the moment of vindication. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, internal confirmation, a feeling of deep, unshakable rightness. She thought of her father, of his careful hands drawing diagrams by lamplight, of his quiet insistence on observing the world as it was, not as people assumed it to be. He had seen the truth hidden in the stone, and she had honored his vision with her own two hands. She had taken his principle and made it manifest, turning an abstract theory into a warm, life-sustaining reality. It was a quiet triumph, witnessed only by herself, but it was the most profound victory of her life. Her moment of reflection was broken by a movement to the east. A figure was struggling through the deep snow, a dark shape against the glaring white. As he drew closer, she recognized the determined, lumbering gait of Amos Kelleher. He was wrapped in thick coats and scarves, only his eyes visible, and he moved with the urgency of a man pushed to his limit. His own shack was barely visible, a low mound with a plume of smoke rising weakly from its chimney. He was likely checking on her, the practical man fulfilling his duty to the foolish widow he had expected to find frozen in her hole. He probably carried a grim speech of condolence in his mind. He finally reached her, breathing hard, his beard and eyebrows caked with ice. "Mrs. Vance," he gasped, his voice raspy from the cold air. Are you all right? The storm." He trailed off, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw her standing in the doorway of the shack, wearing a coat, but not bundled as if for the apocalypse. He saw the tranquil plume of smoke rising from her chimney. He saw no signs of distress. "We are well, Mr. Kelleher. Thank you for coming to check on us." Her voice was calm, clear. The contrast between her composure and his own exhausted state was stark. He stared, perplexed. "But the cold. My fire's been roaring for 3 days straight. Burned through near a quarter cord. It's still colder in my parlor than it is in a barn. How did that tiny shack survive?" "We weren't in the shack," she said, her voice even. "Would you care to come in?" She stepped back, holding the door open. Suspicion and curiosity warred on his face. He nodded, stomping the snow from his boots before stepping into the relative shelter of the shack. The air inside was still brutally cold, but at least it was out of the wind. He looked around at the stored supplies, then his gaze fell on the other door, the heavy, planked one set into the floor. She led the way, opening it and gesturing for him to follow her down the short, earthen tunnel. As he descended the steps, he felt the change. It was a gradual but miraculous shedding of the cold's oppressive weight. He stepped out of the tunnel and into the main room, and he stopped dead. The air was not hot. It was not the stifling, dry heat of an overworked stove. It was simply not cold. It was a gentle, temperate coolness, alive and breathable. He saw Thomas sitting on a rug near the small stove, playing with a set of carved wooden animals. The boy wore a simple woolen shirt, not a mountain of coats. The stove itself had only a few small logs in it, burning with a lazy, efficient flame. Amos slowly unwrapped the scarf from his face, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the smooth stone walls, the sturdy, timbered ceiling, the neatly organized living space. He reached out a gloved hand and placed it on the soapstone wall. He held it there for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he pulled his hand back and looked at Elara. "My fire's been roaring for 3 days," he said, his voice hushed, almost reverent with shock. "And my wife and I have been huddled next to it the entire time. And it is still colder in my home than it is in this cellar." Elara met his gaze. It's not a cellar, Mr. Kelleher. It's a home." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes sweeping the room one more time, taking in every impossible detail. He looked at the small, neat pile of firewood that would not have lasted his own stove half a day. He looked at the comfortable child. He looked at the calm, capable woman standing before him. The rigid certainty he had carried for months crumbled into dust. He had been so sure, so logical, so completely and utterly wrong. "You were right," he said, the words plain, unadorned, and heavy with the weight of a fundamental truth being acknowledged. "You were right." The story of Amos Kelleher's visit traveled faster than the freezing wind. He did not couch it in excuses or try to diminish what he had seen. He told the plain truth, that while he had been fighting a losing war against the cold, Elara Vance had been living in quiet comfort. In the following weeks, as the grip of winter tightened, others came. They came not with pity, but with a desperate, hungry curiosity. First, Constance Hartwell, who brought a freshly baked loaf of bread and asked quiet, intelligent questions. Then others, in pairs and small groups. Elara welcomed them all. She showed them her home, let them feel the neutral peace of the stone walls, and let them see her modest wood pile. She brought out her father's journals, laying them open on the simple wooden table. She explained the principle of the thermal flywheel, of the soapstone's unique properties, of the critical importance of the insulating sod roof. She did not gloat or mock their previous skepticism. She simply shared the knowledge, freely and patiently, as her father would have wanted. That winter, the lessons began. Men who had spent their lives building above the ground started to study it. They learned to read the land not just for its fertility, but for its geology. Elara taught them how to recognize soapstone outcroppings, how to test the thermal properties of different types of earth, how to design a structure that worked with the seasons instead of fighting them. The next spring, 2 more families began digging. They followed her model, adapting it to their own plots of land, with Elara offering guidance and advice. The Vance dugout, as it came to be known, was no longer a symbol of madness, but one of profound and practical wisdom. It was a revolution born not of new technology, but of a deeper understanding of the ancient, powerful forces already at play. The house that Elara Vance built served her for the rest of her long life. It remained cool and pleasant through the scorching summers and provided a safe, warm haven through more than 50 brutal Wyoming winters. Her son Thomas grew up within its earthen walls, inheriting not only the home, but the principle behind it. He never knew the terror of a winter night spent feeding a ravenous stove, nor the gnawing fear of a dwindling woodpile. He later helped build similar homes for his own children, passing down the knowledge his grandfather had discovered and his mother had proven. The $1 shack, the symbol of her initial misfortune, stood for decades as the unassuming entrance to the warmest, safest home in the territory. A quiet monument to a woman who listened to the earth instead of the doubts of men, and in doing so, taught a whole community how to truly survive.